Hi everyone, I'm Johanan Munoz, and today I'm going to be discussing chapters 25 and 26. So, I'm going to give a short introduction about the chapters. Um, so, let's begin. So, the chapters are kind of similar to each other, they're very kind of the same. Like I said, just this is just a little introduction. And both chapters deal with the question, how should the criminal justice system supervise people in the community in a way that actually works? So, according to the readings, um, a lot of programs that are out there, they sound good at first. They draw people's attention. They're innovative, but in the readings, it asks us if it actually reduces crime and help people change and improve public safety. In chapter 25, for example, um, we discuss Project Hope, which is a probation model that became very popular in Hawaii because it promised quick, strong results. But is it possible that it might have been praised too soon? And then chapter 26 has a different, broader discussion. Instead of focusing on one program, it gives us like 13 strategies of supervision and reentry, um, in order to reduce recidivism. um, so let's dig a little bit deeper into the chapters, and then we'll analyze them, and we'll analyze the themes in the chapters, and um, see what we can get from them. So, the meat and potatoes of chapter 25. First of all, the chapter is called, or it's titled, Is Project Hope Creating a False Sense of Hope? Um, so, the title already tells us the chapter is like not only describing the project, but it's already questioning it. So, that's one thing. Um, and Project Hope stands for Hawaii Opportunity Probation with Enforcement. So, um, let me read a little bit of Project Hope. Project Hope was first developed in Honolulu, Hawaii in 2004 by Judge Stephen Alm in the Criminal Felony Division. Alm noticed a pattern among the cases brought before him by the probation department. Case after case involved an offender with multiple violations, who, according to the probation officer, would not be able to complete probation successfully in the community. Judge Alm concluded that offenders had come to believe that probation did not have to be taken seriously because there were no immediate substantial consequences for their violations. So, the basic idea behind Hope is that people on probation are given very clear rules. They are warned about what will happen if they break those rules, and they do violate those rules, they get a swift and certain punishment. That's basically how the judge um, um, put it there, because there was a lack of it, right? So, what is what is a fast response? You know, so um, yeah, so the main belief behind Hope is that people will behave better if they know punishment will happen quickly and consistently. It doesn't necessarily have to be a huge punishment. and not always a long punishment, but a punishment that is certain and immediate. That's basically what hope is about. So the chapter explains that this method appealed to many people. Why? Well, because many people were frustrated, like we read. Um, they were frustrated with traditional probation systems. Um, in many places, offenders could break rules over and over, and nothing happened right away. And the court dates were always delayed. Sanctions came late, and and some people kept violating with no consequence. So hope seemed to initiate something different. Um, so hope basically kind of said, "Okay, we're not waiting forever. We're gonna do something right away," and it appealed to people. The people thought that it was different. It made hope sound efficient, and this is what people wanted, and that's why it got so much attention. Um, so I just like I read, uh, cha- chapter 25 explains how hope started, and it was developed in Honolulu in 2004 by Judge Stephen Alm, just like I read. And he noticed a pattern among people on probation. Many were repeatedly violating conditions, they missed appointments, they failed drug tests, they ignored the rules. And, well, because the system moved kind of slowly, they did not always feel any immediate pressure to comply. So Judge Alm thought that probation systems were not working well because it wasn't providing quick enough responses. So he basically said, "We're not going to have this." So the judge believed that the offenders had learned that probation was not serious, so he wanted to change that. So he created a solution. So he created a system in which violations were met with a quick response, quick punishment to fit that violation. And that basically became the foundation for Project Hope. Um, if we read further into the chapter, it explains that Judge Alm didn't do this alone. He obviously needed the cooperation of many parts of the justice system, um, from the probation officers, the court staff, the prosecutors, defense attorneys, law enforcement, obviously, and the jail staff. And I think this is very important to note because Hope was not just one rule issued by the court or one agency. See, it depended on the whole system working together, which is what it should do in the first place. Um, but sometimes the system does not coordinate, and that's why things don't work sometimes as intended. Um, so how does Project Hope works? Um, in the chapter, we read that um, we read the process of Project Hope. And so, just to give you the main parts, first of all, how you get into hope. How does somebody get into the gears of hope? Um, they go what is called a warning hearing. That's what I see. Once a probationer, I'm sorry, has been deemed eligible for hope, there is a warning hearing. Um, at the hearing, the judge explains the rules very clearly, and the probationer is told exactly what is expected. The judge also explains to the probationer that what will happen if he breaks the rules or he or she breaks the rules. So this is so that the probationer does not come back later and say, "Oh, I didn't understand that," or "I didn't know that." No, again, the judge explains to him the rules very clearly and what will happen if the person breaks those rules. The second comes the drug testing and monitoring. Mon- monitor monitoring. So, um, so many Hope participants are drug offenders, obviously, right? So, drug testing is it's a major part of the program. So, in the chapter, we read that probationers are assigned a color code and must call in daily to find out whether they must come in for testing or not that day. So, this causes the testing to be frequent and unpredictable. Third, quick response to violations. So if a person misses a meeting or a test, or tests positive for drugs, the system responds fast. That's one of the main things about it, that it will respond fast. So instead of waiting weeks or months, Project Hope will arrest the person quickly, like sometimes right there, you know, to bring the violation before the court. The person may then receive a short jail term or another type of sanction, but um, immediate. It comes immediate. That's the main thing. Um, Number four, graduated sanctions. So the punishment, what that means is that the punishment will increase if the person keeps violating. So the system is not just random; it follows a pattern. Um, and in fifth place, uh, there's treatment if needed. So the chapter also explains that some people in Hope can be referred to like drug treatment, especially if repeated drug tests show a serious problem. So even though Hope is often seen as a punishment-based model, it does include some treatment elements. And I think this is important if a person has a drug problem, because I believe that they should also get some sort of treatment. We're actually discussing this in a different class in criminal justice. Anyway, so why Hope became popular? Um, how why it becomes so popular? So one of the most important parts of chapter 25, it explains to us that it doesn't just tells us whether it works or not, because it does. It also tells us why it became so popular. And well, Hope gained a lot of popularity for several reasons, and not all of them were based purely on solid evidence. And that's important. That's really important. Um, so, what are the reasons behind this popularity? Well, number one, it took out the stigma. It took out the stigma of um, hope, the name. That's it. Just hope. It has a good connotation. It feels good. Um, if the program had a cold technical name, it probably would not have the same emotional appeal. So it sounds positive. It sounds hopeful. It sounds like um, it's gonna work. It sounds like whatever you're dealing with, there's a solution coming. Um, it suggests that there's help, that there's change, redemption, second chances, and it appealed to people. People like that, and people will support stuff like that. Um, Secondly, it appealed to both conservatives and liberals. So the chapter describes hope as kind of a tough love approach. Um, on one side, conservatives may like it because it stresses accountability. rules and punishment. It's swift. And liberals may like it because it can reduce long prison stays and give some people access to treatment. So, in a way, excuse me, it appealed to both sides. And, you know, in our time and age, that's important politically. Um, Number three, Judge Alm played a huge role in all this. He was a very strong and persuasive leader. He had credibility, he had experience, he was very energetic. So obviously, he became the public face of the program. Um, so all that combined together, the effects, and Judge Alm's efficiency, it helped hope spread outside of Hawaii. Um, and another reason is the researchers and supporters promoted it. So in the chapter, we read that some of the researchers and advocates helped present hope as a promising model that actually worked. And number five, it gained legitimacy from criminal criminal criminologists and professors. So in the academic world, it gained a lot of support um, and legitimacy. And in the chapter, we read that that support and attention came from the NIG, and also helped Hope. Once a program gets that kind of institutional approval, people often assume it must be strongly proven. Um, but that's exactly what the authors warn us about. Like, that's exactly what the chapter is. That's where the issue is. And that's what we're going to analyze. Um, so let's hear some of the criticisms for Hope. Um, in the book, we read that, well, Hope is not necessarily useless. That's not the criticism. And they never say that they should have never tried it. They never say that Hawaii should have never done something like this. So what they mean is that it probably was praised too fast, too much, and too wide. In other words, it might have created a false sense of hope. No pun intended, or maybe. So the authors argue that evidence behind hope is more limited than people realize. You know, some studies showed some positive effects, but honestly, the research is mixed, and some of the praise for hope has gone beyond what the evidence actually supports. And this is important because um, in criminal justice, um, the systems can get excited about a program and copy it everywhere before fully understanding why it worked, whether it really worked, and whether it would work somewhere else. And that's the danger that you know the chapter keeps coming back to. Um, Another is why the authors think hope may have been oversold. Um, so the chapter actually gives us a couple of reasons for this. First, the program, or the advocates for the program, gave too much emphasis in one key ingredient. Um, they put too much faith in swift and certain punishment. The program assumes that swift punishment is the primary factor driving compliance and to reduce recidivism, but the evidence does not clearly show that punishment by itself is the answer. Um, Critics point out that research on deterrence is more complicated than that. Some people do respond to punishment, but many offenders, especially high risk offenders, are affected by deeper problems such as antisocial thinking, people that can't get along with society, um, drug addiction, unstable relationships, poor employment history, weak support systems, and long term criminal habits. So, the argument here is that punishment alone may not change those deeper issues. Um, so, it is possible that hope may have been the advocates for hope may be focusing too much on one piece of the puzzle. So, second, there is not enough emphasis on active ingredients that really change people. Um, what that means is um, Hope's success might actually come from aspects of the program beyond punishment, even though the aspects get less attention. For example, um, stronger officer involvement, better communication, clearer expectations, relationship quality, treatment referrals, and structured case management. So the reading suggests that these may be the real active ingredients, or at least a big part of them. So if other places copy Hope, but only copy the sanctions part, they may miss what actually made it work in Hawaii. And that's another deal. Um, Another criticism is failure to identify alternative explanations. Um, so in the chapter, we read that there has not been enough process evaluation to know exactly what caused Hope's outcomes. Um, so what that means is that if the results look good, we still don't know why. Was it the sanctions? Was it the judge? Was it teamwork, treatment, the culture of the court? Was it the personal style of officers? We don't know. And if we don't know, then copying the model somewhere else becomes risky. You know what I'm saying? Um, so it's hard to replicate in other places. Um, for example, um, it worked in Hawaii because Hawaii had unique conditions. First of all, it had the leadership from Judge Alm. They had strong cooperation across agencies, local relationships, coordination with probation staff, and the whole structure was just it was gears put together that fit perfectly. And well, I mean, other places might not have those same conditions. So somebody might say, or an agency, or a state or county, they might say, "Oh, we're doing Hope now," but really only copy the visible parts, like the drug testing and quick jail sanctions, without going deeper into the system. Um, without copying what actually helped the original model, and what made it function. So a copied version may fail because circumstances might not be the same. And also, another criticism is that it may be used on the wrong offenders. So, the authors of the book, chapter 25, and they tell us that Hope was mainly studied with drug involved offenders. Look, offenders are people, and all people are different. Offenders require different methods of approach. So it doesn't automatically mean Hope will work the same way for everyone, you know? Some of the offenders may need much more treatment and rehabilitation than punishment. Other people may not need such an intensive model at all. So the argument here is that hope may be inappropriate if used too broadly, if that makes any sense. Um, Another criticism is it focuses too much on technical violations, um, like missed appointments, dirty drug tests, non-compliance with supervision conditions. But let's analyze. Let's analyze this. So what I mean, what if technical violations are not the main driver of future crime? Is a missed appointment really a main driver of future crime? I mean, if that's true, then building a whole system around punishment, around punishing technical violations, might not do much to reduce serious recidivism in the long term. I mean, think about it, right? So another criticism is that it may open up Pandora box of punishment-oriented probation. Again, let's analyze it. Um, so hope could push probation systems further toward punishment and away from rehabilitation. If the correction systems becomes obsessed with certainty, sanctions, surveillance, enforcement, then treatment and human services may get pushed aside. You know, that's what it means when I say it may open up Pandora box of punishment oriented probation, and people might not like this. This might cause a serious problem for the project. Um, Criminal justice history teaches us that punishment focused reforms often create unintended consequences. So what I'm saying is, let's hope that hope does not pull probation into harder, more punitive directions while pretending to be a program about reform. Does that make sense? Um, all right, let's switch gears now into the research. Let's be clear. The chapter doesn't say, I didn't read anything in the chapter that that positive outcomes have happened. There's nothing to deny that something happened. In fact, the research shows that hope has certainly seen reductions in things like missed appointments, positive drug tests, and sometimes arrests. But in analyzing the results, we need caution for a few reasons. First, some studies were limited. Some studies had short follow up periods, meaning the data is not complete. That means that we may know what happened in the short term, but not in the long term. Second, not all studies were equally strong. The chapter talks about the importance of strong research methods like randomized control trials, and some hope studies were more rigorous than others. So, what's the reasoning behind this? We don't know. We just don't know. Um, Number three, the results outside of Hawaii were mixed. Period. That's not debatable. If a program works in one place but gets mixed results somewhere else, that means you know there's a lack of context that has some more important role here. There's something going on there. I'm like, again, I'm not saying the program is bad. What I'm saying is that the program is not some universal miracle, and it should be followed everywhere. It would be exaggerated, to think or to implement a program like this everywhere where it's not fully tested and examined. So the big idea of chapter 25, I put it like this. Definitely there has some value. Hope has definitely has some value, and it has proven to work in Hawaii. But it shouldn't be treated like a solution and implemented everywhere in the country. I'd say be careful, skeptical, and evidence based on these types of projects. Um, I'd also say that based on what the readings say, excuse me, corrections should not jump into a popular program just because it sounds good or it's spread fast or, you know, because people supported it or, it looks promising. Instead, I think, excuse me, we should, you know, corrections should ask harder questions. What exactly is causing the results? Ask deeper questions into a program. Can it be replicated? For whom does it work? Under what conditions? What are the hidden costs? And what gets ignored when this program becomes popular? It's a warning against exaggerated public promotion. All right. So moving on to chapter 26, public, I'm sorry, putting public safety first. Um, 13 strategies for successful reentry, supervision and reentry. Um, so this chapter is a lot more practical. It comes from the Pew Center on the states and gives a broad roadmap for how supervision and reentry should work. Instead of focusing on one special program, this chapter gives us 13 strategies supposed to improve outcomes. So the core message is this: supervision should not just be about catching offenders doing something wrong. It should be about reducing recidivism and improving public safety. That sounds obvious, right? But many systems still focus too much on contact, control, and law enforcement. Instead of the things that truly lower reoffending. So let's analyze this. Let's go a little bit deeper. So the chapter is trying to shift probation and parole from an older model toward a smarter model. Um, okay, sorry about that. I had a couple of technical difficulties, but we're back. So the first strategy says agencies need to clearly define success. English is not my first language. Sorry. The first strategy says that agencies need to clearly define success. So too often, probation and parole agencies measure success by outputs like number of contacts, number of meetings, number of rules enforced. Um, but are those things really the goal? No. The goal should be lower recidivism, lower substance abuse, better employment, better integration, less victimization, and stronger public safety. So agencies should measure what's really important. So if you want to measure the wrong thing, that's fine, but you know that will only cause staff to focus on the wrong thing. If officers are judged by how many people they catch doing wrong, then the system becomes about catching. If officers are judged by whether people succeed, then the system changes. And that's the main point. Strategy number two: tailor conditions with supervision. So the chapter says supervision conditions should not be long, generic lists that almost nobody can realistically follow. Let's analyze this a bit. Instead, conditions should be realistic and research based. We realistic, relevant, and research based. That's the three R's. This means that conditions should fit the individual, which makes sense. For example, if someone's major risk factor is drug addiction, then the supervision plan should focus on treatment and accountability in that area. If someone struggles with employment or unstable housing, then the focus should be there. The point is that supervision should be a one size fits all. And there should not be like older systems where everybody gets a giant list of rules, whether those rules connect to the risk factors or not. Um, the third strategy talks about focus resources on higher risk offenders. This is one of the most important strategies in the chapter. So we read that research shows that the biggest benefits come when agencies focus the most supervision and services on higher risk offenders. That means that people who are more likely to reoffend need more attention, more structure and help overall. But also the opposite is true. Giving too much intervention to low risk offenders may do little good and can even make outcomes worse. In other words, don't waste heavy supervision on people who are already likely to succeed. Put the resources where the risk is highest. The point is not to waste money and time where it isn't needed. Um, Strategy number four talks about frontland supervision resources. And in this strategy, the period right after release is often the most dangerous and unstable time. That's when people are most at risk for relapse, new crime, missed appointments, homelessness, unemployment, and just general chaos. So in a way, agencies should put more effort and support into the first days and weeks after release. Like case planning, treatment access, housing help, and more focused supervision. The chapter gives us a like resources that front loading resources is important because it is when people mostly need it and when risks are often the highest. um, Strategy five, implement earned discharge. What this means is giving offenders a chance to reduce their supervision term by meeting clear goals, and following the rules. In other words, if someone is doing well, staying sober, working and complying, they should be able to, earn their way off supervision sooner. It rewards progress and it frees up time and resources. And that's fine. Supervision should include rewards, not just punishment. Sometimes we tell our children, you cannot go outside to play because you disobeyed me. And some parents might say, well, you can go outside after you finish cleaning your room. You hear the difference there? Both work, depending on the parent and the parenting method you're using. In the same way, corrections use the same approach, only with much older children. Strategy number six is about supervising offenders in their communities. You know, this supports the place-based approach. Instead of keeping supervision distant and office-centered, agencies should supervise people in the communities where they actually live and work. You know, it also cuts down on wasted time, and it makes supervision more practical. Strategy seven: engage partners to expand intervention capacity. People on supervision often need help with treatment, mental health, housing, employment, etc. So it is only fair that agencies partner with treatment providers, housing authorities, employers, you know. And I think this is important because successful reentry in- into back to society involves some or more faces than the criminal justice system. We're starting to see how the heroes work inside and out. Um, a probation officer alone cannot solve addiction, homelessness, trauma. Everything we said. So there's a push for collaboration. Strategy eight. Um, there's assess criminal risk and need factors. So agencies should use reliable tools to identify who's at risk, who's high risk, and who's low risk. What type of supervision the person needs, and that makes sense. Using the right tools for uh, other than relying on personal judgment. And I think that's important. Because if we give too much supervision to the wrong people, too little support who those who truly need it, then it's everything fails. So strategy number nine, balance surveillance and treatment in case plans. I think this is also important, because all plans should not be about surveillance and no treatment. Yeah, supervision matters. That's true, and accountability is also important. But the treatment and support are equally important. You know, the research shows that combining surveillance with treatment is more effective than relying solely on control. So, excuse me, case plans should include person's risk factors, treatment needs, goals, and responsibilities. Again, this is about moving away from narrow punishment role. Strategy 10, involve offenders in the supervision process. You know, um, if the person under supervision, they should not be treated like a passive object. They should be involved in developing goals, participating in the plan. Why? Well, because when people take part of the process, they're more likely to feel involved and somehow accountable. It helps motivate the person. Strategy 11, engage in formal social controls. I personally like this one. Formal supervision is only one part of an offender's life. Most of the time, people are influenced not only by the probation officer but also by other factors like family, friends, employers, church, whatever. And that's what they call informal social controls. And I like it because these relationships can be more powerful than formal legal controls, in the process of behavior change. See, supervision should try to identify and strengthen healthy support networks. Instead of just asking what rules are in place, it should be like, what does this person need to be better? I've seen it in real life. Strategy 12, use incentives and rewards, positive reinforcement, as we said before, in parenting. It's not only about punishing violations, they should also reward progress, it certificates, for the progress. Reduce reporting requirements, lower supervision burdens, delayed payments, or even reduce restrictions. The point is simple. We want more good behavior, so reward it. Just like some parents do. You know, if this idea is obvious in parenting and education and sports and work, why they don't do it in corrections? I don't understand. And strategy 13, it responds to violations with swift certain sanctions. So this is where chapter 26 and 25 overlap. The Pew chapter says that when violations happen, agencies should respond quickly and consistently using sanctions that are proportional. But not every violation should send someone straight to prison. Violations can be handled in the community with short responses, graduated consequences. Um, this is smarter and cheaper and actually more effective, than waiting until a person completely collapses under supervision, then revoking it. That doesn't make sense. Um, so in chapter 26, we read that support and Swift, that chapter 26 does support Swift and certain responses. But unlike chapter 25, as we talked about hope, it places that idea inside a bigger framework that also includes incentives, treatment, risk management, support network, case planning, and public safety goals. So it's important to make this differentiation because we want programs to work, and it takes a lot of effort for this to happen. I also uploaded a couple of articles to my presentation, which you can find attached, and I want to analyze them, and share some important ideas regarding chapter 25 and 26. The two articles I downloaded were, both are peer-reviewed articles, rethinking the use of community supervision and probation and parole revocations. Reviewing 2 decades of revocation decisions in the United States. So both of these articles help me think more deeply about what the chapters are saying. Like it makes me think because these are real problems in probation and parole and reentry systems around the country. The first article connects especially with chapter 26, but it helped me better understand chapter 25. It makes a compelling argument that community supervision is often treated as a good alternative to prison, but in reality, it can become delayed. You know, it can become a delayed path back to prison, and I think that that's one of the most important ideas of the article. A lot of times people hear words like probation, parole, community supervision, and assume that means the system is being more flexible and more humane. But no. In the article we read that many people under supervision end up returning to jail or to prison, not because they committed a serious crime, but because they violated that condition. That means community supervision can actually give you more jail time rather than reduce the incarceration. So the idea fits very well with chapter 26, which keeps asking what supervision is actually supposed to do. Well, it's supposed to just watch people closely and punish them when they mess up. Really? Is it supposed to improve safety and help people succeed in the community? I think the latter. So the article is basically about supervision and how it's overloaded with too many rules, too many conditions, and too much focus on violations. It stops being a real alternative and becomes a trap. Um, Another important point in this article is that it doesn't simply call for more supervision. In fact, it it argues that the system should sometimes limit rather than expand the use of community supervision. I've always heard that some supervision means greater safety, but apparently studies show otherwise. The author of the article says that supervision should be used less frequently for shorter periods and under fewer conditions. So I didn't read any indications of anti-supervision in chapter 26, but the chapter does say that, as we already seen, that supervision should be targeted and evidence based. It says that resources should be focused more on higher risk offenders rather than spread equally across everyone. So when I compare the article to the chapter, I see a similar message. Um, you know, in the second article, probation and parole revocations, reviewing 2 decades of revocation decision in the United States. So this article aligns more with chapter 26 because it focuses on successful supervision and reentry. You know, um, what I liked about this article is that it doesn't just give one opinion. It reviews many studies over a long period. So instead of saying, here's one program or here's a local result, it looks at a bigger body of research. It gives a broader perspective. You know, um, One of the major findings that this article talks about is that revocations contribute into incarceration rates, even though the exact extent is not always measured consistently across studies. If supervision is supposed to promote successful reentry, but it keeps sending large numbers of people back to prison, then where is the rehabilitation of the released? That's something that the system has to confront. The article also talks about revocate that revocation often comes from the accumulation of technical violations. Especially ongoing treatment of noncompliance and program noncompliance. And I think that that's very important because it shows that revocation usually does not occur from a single tiny mistake. It often happens because of violations build up over time. In other words, the the system may look at a person and say, "This is not just one issue. This is a pattern now." You know. Um, Another important topic in the revocation article is the role of evidence-based practices. The article explains that community corrections shifted over time from a rehabilitation model to a more punitive model, especially during the get tough on crime era. But then evidence-based approaches began to develop as a response. You know, so that's basically chapter 26. The article um, Um, not some small takeaways. Not just surveillance, not just punishment, but also treatment and support. Um, and I think that um, um, the articles push that same kind of thinking. They do not say that supervision should disappear, but they do force us to ask what supervision is doing, and who is helping, who is failing, and whether it is truly reducing recidivism or just widening the net of punishment. Um, so to me, one of the most useful takeaways from the readings is that the articles both support the skepticism of chapter 25 by showing that supervision can be overused and revocation can drive incarceration, but they also support the practical side of chapter 26 by showing the need for targeted supervision, evidence-based responses, treatment, and real entry support. So if I had to boil it down, the biggest lesson from the articles and the chapters together, I would say supervision only makes sense if it is focused, fair, and connected to real behavior. So, in conclusion, if supervision is too broad, it can fail. If supervision is too punitive,